On April 10, 1912, RMS Titanic set out on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York.
Britain's wonder of the world, Titanic, the 46,000-ton liner, set out proudly on her maiden voyage to America.
On the night of April 14th, the ship struck an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean. 2.5 hours later, the world's newest and greatest ocean liner sank below the waves. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing waters. Since the day of the disaster, legend has overtaken fact, and there are many questions surrounding the sinking. Was the voyage doomed from the start? Could the accident have been avoided? Who benefited financially? Was it even the Titanic that actually sank? Theories have encircled this tragedy for over a century, and we're about to set the record straight.
I'm Stu, this is Debunked, and we're here to talk the truths from the myths and the facts from the misconceptions.
The Unsinkable Ship.
Titanic, the 46,000-ton liner that couldn't sink.
It's a classic case of dramatic irony.
So this is the ship they say is unsinkable.
It is unsinkable. God himself could not sink this ship.
Movies and novels love to point out that the owners of the Titanic boasted that it was unsinkable.
But this ship can't sink.
But was this ever actually said? Well, yes and no. White Star Line, the company that owned Titanic, sold the ocean liner on its luxury rather than its indestructibility. And luxury is what passengers were interested in. After all, if you spent the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money on a top-class Titanic ticket, you'd be more interested in the swimming pool, the walk-in wardrobes, and the 10-course dinners than the height of the bulkheads. Still, Titanic was the most advanced ship ever built at the time, and a brochure published in 1910 does say,
"As far as it is possible to do so, this wonderful vessel is designed to be unsinkable."
However, the moment that popularised the unsinkable boast didn't happen until after the Titanic hit the iceberg. In New York, a man called Philip Franklin was in charge of White Star Line's office on the night of April 15, 1912. When the first news came through over the radio that Titanic was in distress, he tried to reassure the passengers' worried relatives and reporters by telling them,
"There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers."
After this, the words Titanic and unsinkable became inseparable, but only ironically. The Wrath of God. Legend has it that Catholic workers in Titanic's shipyard refused to work because its hull number, 390904, written backwards, spells no Pope. For one thing, the number was never assigned to Titanic in any way. On the other hand, it's true that Catholic yard workers didn't work on Titanic because they weren't hired to. The company that built Titanic prided itself on the fact that it only hired Protestants. However, another story purportedly proves Titanic was doomed. As you know, whether you're going to sea or outer space, it's tradition to christen a ship by breaking a bottle of champagne over its bow, but when it came to christening the Titanic, the bottle refused to break. Although it's true that no champagne bottle ever smashed against Titanic, this is because it's a purely optional tradition that White Star Line didn't follow. Instead, they kept all 12,000 bottles of wine intact for the passengers to drink. Most of those bottles are still with the shipwreck, and might still be drinkable even today.
Bottles kept at the bottom of the sea are better kept than in the finest wine cellars.
The Curse of Titanic. Another myth says Titanic suffered the curse of an Egyptian mummy in its hold. The cargo manifests prove there was no mummy on board the Titanic. This story almost certainly comes from the Washington Post. Less than a month after Titanic sank, the Post ran an article about William T. Stead, a journalist who drowned when Titanic went down. And the Washington Post reported that he believed strongly in the curse of a mummy that was brought to the British Museum in 1889. Except it's just the painted lid of a wooden coffin. In fact, the whole curse was invented by Stead himself just for fun, and he told it to his fellow passengers on board Titanic. When survivors recounted this, the Washington Post put the disaster and the mummy together. Presto, curse concocted. Weirdly, in 1886, William Stead wrote a short story about a steamship that sinks and doesn't have enough lifeboats aboard, resulting in unnecessarily high casualties. Which brings us on to the next common misconception about Titanic. Titanic's lifeboats. One of the most tragic facts about the Titanic is that there weren't enough lifeboats for all the people on board. This is often attributed to corporate greed and a callous disregard for human life, at least for humans who hadn't bought a first-class ticket. The idea that the class prejudice led to many unnecessary deaths is often backed up by the claim that third-class passengers were locked below decks while the ship sank. It's absolutely true that there were lockable gates on Titanic's lower decks because US immigration control required it, and these gates were locked at night. But as soon as the order to lower the lifeboats was given, the gates were open too. The bigger problem third-class passengers faced was the sheer distance between their quarters and the lifeboats on the top deck. It's not a huge surprise that 60% of first-class passengers survived, compared to 25% of third-class passengers, when poorer passengers had farther to go to reach the limited spaces on the lifeboats. But while it is true that Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats to save everyone, the shipbuilders actually provided more lifeboats than were required by law. Regulations were based on the size of a ship and not the number of people on board. In 1912, the Board of Trade required British vessels that weighed over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats with capacity for just 50% of the passengers and crew. Titanic had 20 lifeboats, enough for 52% of the people on board. So in fact, Titanic exceeded requirements of the time. Sadly, the tragedy was exacerbated by the fact that the lifeboats were not used to their full capacity. Records show that the most loaded lifeboat was at 88% capacity. The least full lifeboat held only a third of the people it was designed to carry. This may partly be a result of the famous order to evacuate women and children first, a command that really was given by Captain Edward Smith.
I'm ordering all women and children into the boats.
This gave rise to a story that one man snuck onto a lifeboat by disguising himself in women's clothing. This is false. For one thing, 4 different men were accused of being the cowardly crossdresser. The extensive inquiries into the sinking prove that all 4 of these men got onto lifeboats in perfectly permissible pantalooned fashion. In the case of William T. Sloper, the accusation came from a reporter who was annoyed that he was refusing to talk to the press, and J. Bruce Ismay fell afoul of the rumour because he was the chairman of White Star Line, and many people felt he should have gone down with his ship. Only one male survivor was encountered wearing an item of women's clothing, third-class passenger Daniel Buckley. He was already in a lifeboat when a female passenger threw her shawl over him to hide him from crew members who were forcing men out of their lifeboat. He kept the shawl on when the lifeboat set out onto the cold waters of the Atlantic. This is the only case of a man escaping Titanic thanks to women's clothing. But his story didn't emerge until after newspapers had already made their claim about the other men. However, even the order to evacuate women and children first wasn't strictly obeyed by First Officer William McMaster Murdoch. He was happy to let men on the boat when he couldn't find any women or children to put on. You may remember Murdoch from the James Cameron movie. He's the Scottish officer who shoots himself after shooting some of the male passengers trying to force their way onto a lifeboat.
Women and children only! I'll shoot any man who tries to get past me, get back!
This never happened, and there are no purported incidents of crew members killing passengers. The transatlantic speed record. It's a commonly held belief that Captain Smith and his crew were trying to set the transatlantic speed record to win the Blue Ribbon accolade, and as such, ignored multiple warnings about dangerous ice on the route. It is true that Titanic was going at full speed when it hit the iceberg, but it wasn't because Captain Smith was trying to set records. Titanic was built for comfort, not speed. It was about 5 knots slower than the fastest liners of the day. Besides that, the route Smith followed was 200 miles longer than the fastest shipping lane across the Atlantic. Ironically, he chose this route to avoid dangerous ice further north. In reality, the story that Smith was trying to set a speed record comes from American newspapers, in particular from the newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was angry with J. Bruce Ismay for not cooperating with the press, so in addition to printing the rumours about Ismay dressing as a woman to survive Titanic, Hearst made up a story that Ismay ordered Captain Smith to make the crossing in record time, regardless of passenger safety. However, it is true that on the day it sank, Titanic received 6 warnings of dangerous ice ahead, At least 3 of these were reported directly to Captain Smith. The official US Senate inquiry concluded that
no officers' conference was called to consider these warnings. No heed was given to them.
So the US government clearly felt Captain Smith acted badly. But Smith was never able to speak in his defense, and the same Senate report didn't trust witness statements that the ship broke in two, which we know is exactly what happened. So, why was Smith travelling at full speed through icy waters? Well, the answer may lie in a fire in one of Titanic's coal bunkers. Coal frequently caught fire on steamships thanks to spontaneous combustion, and this happened on Titanic. In 2004, engineer Robert Essenhive pointed out that a common method of controlling fires like these was to shovel the burning coal into the boiler, which means the ship would have had to keep cruising at high speed, although Essenhive admitted he was just speculating. Another myth surrounding Captain Smith is that he was drunk when Titanic hit the iceberg. In truth, he was in his cabin after attending a first-class dinner party, so he probably wasn't in the best frame of mind to steer the ship clear of icebergs. But he didn't have to. Instead, Smith had put First Officer Murdoch in charge, and it was he who had to make the urgent decisions when the lookouts in the crow's nest spotted the iceberg. Witnesses say that Murdoch ordered the engines to reverse and the helm to steer hard a starboard, away from the iceberg.
Hard starboard!
This was part of a standard maneuver to sail around obstacles in the water. It might have worked, except that the crew lookouts didn't see the iceberg until it was too late. This is partly because the binoculars in the crow's nest were in a locked case, and no one had the key. In fact, Second Officer Charles Lightoller had promised to buy new binoculars for the lookouts once the ship arrived in New York. Unlike Captain Smith and First Officer Murdoch, Lightoller survived. However, Charles Lightoller's granddaughter, Louise Patton, says Lightoller told her that Murdoch's order to turn hard at starboard was misunderstood by the helmsman. This is because the helmsman was trained to steer modern steamships, which issued orders based on the direction of the bow. In contrast, officers like Murdoch trained to use the old-fashioned orders for sailing ships, which were based on the direction of the tiller, and is always opposite to the direction you want the bow to go. So when Murdoch ordered the helmsman to turn hard at starboard, or right, he actually wanted the helmsman to put the tiller as far right as possible to starboard, and turn the rudder, the wheel and the bow to the left. Instead, the helmsman turned the wheel right, as he had learned in training. Interestingly, Lightoller's granddaughter revealed this to promote a book she wrote in 2010. Lightoller himself never said a word of this to the authorities investigating the tragedy. Supposedly, he wanted to protect the reputation of the crew and the company, White Star Line. But were these allegations to be true, then the second watch officer who supervised the helmsman's actions would have also missed the error, meaning all 3 experienced crew members got it wrong. Titanic never sank. That's right, there's a theory about insurance fraud that meant the Titanic ship itself never sank. Instead, some believe its sister ship, the RMS Olympic, was the boat that sank on that fateful night. Originally put forward by theorist Robin Gardner in 1998, the theory goes like this. In 1911, the Olympic collided with a Royal Naval warship. The accident damaged its hull and central turbines, but the ship's insurers refused to pay the $800,000 for repairs. Since the Olympic was being fixed in the same dockyard that the Titanic was being built in, and since Titanic followed the same design as Olympic, the owners decided to swap the ships, sink the Titanic, and collect the insurance to pay for the repairs. The Olympic would continue to sail the seas until it was retired in 1935. But in reality, it was the Titanic. The tragic loss of life occurred because the plan to rescue everyone was completely botched. According to Gardner, the swap would have been relatively easy to achieve, because the ship's name was only put on removable objects like lifeboats and the ship's bell. Even though photographs clearly show that the ship's names were put on their bow, this theory seemed quite plausible until you really think about it. Maritime author Mark Chirnside pointed out that it cost $7.5 million to build Titanic, but White Star Line insured it for just $5 million. This means the loss they made on Titanic was greater than the cost of repairs on the Olympic. Furthermore, the shipwreck has the number 401 stamped all over it. This was Titanic's hull number, not Olympic's. Nevertheless, some people still believe it was a scam, and that the scam was the brainchild of the owner of White Star Line, JP Morgan. The theories involving JP Morgan don't stop there either. He was one of the most powerful bankers of the time, and if the financier didn't sink Titanic as part of an insurance fraud, he orchestrated it to kill his rivals who opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. But the titanic weight of evidence against this theory being true might explain why there's another version of it floating around on the internet that says the Rothschilds planned it. But there's even less proof for this than the Morgan theory. So I'm afraid for all the conspiracy enthusiasts out there, the story of Titanic is simply a tragic example of a maritime disaster. If you would like to see more videos like this, perhaps about the moon landing or such like, then please let us know in the comments. In the meantime, while you're out there surfing the web, do your best to avoid a Titanic-sized disaster of your own, and stay safe online with NordVPN. NordVPN can keep you anonymous with its double data encryption. And not only that, the amazing thing about a VPN is that it allows you to access geo-restricted content. That means accessing content that is usually only available in other countries. Recognize this message? Sorry, this content is only available to viewers in insert country name. Well, select one of NordVPN's servers in that country, and hey presto, you're watching your favorite show. Thanks to NordVPN, they're offering Debunked viewers a whopping 70% off of a 3-year plan, plus 1 month free to get you started. Just visit nordvpn.com/debunked and use code DEBUNKED to take advantage of this incredible deal. NordVPN is one of the most trusted VPNs available. They also provide you with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's nothing to lose. Support from partners like NordVPN allow us to keep making videos, so please head on over and give them a try. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out some more Debunked on screen now. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.